Welcome to LaunchPod, a product management podcast from LogRocket. Today, our guest is Scott Lux, Vice President of Global E-commerce and Technology at Esprit, a retail, apparel, and fashion company. Scott started his career in financial consulting at Fidelity before transitioning to program and product management at Infospace. From there, Scott moved into product management roles at companies like Chase, VML COMMERCE, L'Oreal, and American Express. Prior to joining Esprit, he led digital marketing and e-commerce initiatives at Diesel, Intermix, VIDEOSHOPS, and Eberjey. On today's episode, LogRocket's VP of Marketing, Jeff Wharton, talks to Scott about the evolution of e-commerce and how it has affected commerce as a whole, how SaaS has both improved e-commerce but has brought with it complexities like site performance and tackling a new user experience, and how to build a cohesive brand in a competitive landscape, underlining the importance of adapting to new customer touchpoints. So here it is, our conversation with Scott Lux.
Hey, Scott, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
It's rare to find someone who has spent a lot of career in product. Typically, people come to it from different angles, and this has been one where we talk to leaders who come to it from sales or from engineering, but you got a nice, healthy background in product, which is cool. So looking forward to digging into that. Before we do, I like to warm up a little bit and just ask a few questions. I think this is my favorite one because it has just such a wide aperture of what the answers can be. But when you're talking to people who are not in the tech world or not in the PM role, how do you describe what product management is? Like, you're talking to your aunt, or your uncle, or your grandma. How do you tell them what you do and what product management is?
Oh man, that's a great question. And it usually comes from my mom. So that's the baseline, because I think throughout my career, she will always ask, now, Scott, what do you do? I don't really understand it. Best way I describe product management is just around features or capabilities that we as consumers enjoy and experience. And that could be digital, physical, or human interactions. So that's the context I frame it up in.
Yeah, it's great. Some people get very esoteric with it and kind of larger than life. Some people get very functional to what the feature is and how we decide on what we're going to work on and what features you see in web application or something.
That's where I would lose her.
Yeah, it's always great to see kind of the where the lane someone picks. And I like that you went broad, but still coherent enough where you can really understand what you do versus a little wider. So digging into the role as a PM leader, what are 3 tools you can't live without at work right now?
I'll give you 2 work and 1 non-work.
Perfect.
So one is Slack and or Teams. We go between both. I do prefer Slack over Teams. Second is text and or WhatsApp. So a lot of my team is in Amsterdam and Europe and Hong Kong. So we predominantly use WhatsApp over text, but in the US, I use text as well quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then non-work tool is I love my Garmin. So I'm kind of a pretty avid runner and just love kind of tracking and having that measurement, whether it's for sleep, walks, or running, just to see how my day's progressing. And I would say there's probably a good tie-in to work as well, because I do like to see getting off to a good start for the day with a little bit of cardio.
You're not the first person I've talked to here who talked about getting into your day with a bit of a workout first. So I feel like over the past few years, people have become more aware of that, which is great.
Yeah.
Where do you like to run?
I live in New York on the Upper West Side, and city streets, especially when I travel, I still think that's one of the best ways to get out and explore and see a city. I grew up in Dallas. I have this natural, what I think is a friendly vibe. And so when I pass runners or people, I'm always like, good morning or saying hello. And it's interesting how that jives depending on where I am. Like New York, a lot of times you just get the super aggressive, competitive, don't talk to me. But out west, California, surprisingly super friendly. So it's a good way, again, to get out and explore. In my neighborhood, I have Central Park a block away. So that's where you'll tend to find me if I'm not at work.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I was a runner for a while. I had to give it up, but I live in Boston in the North End, so similarly dense. And the same thing happens. I switched my running cycle from nighttime to daytime. It was really funny seeing the different responses you'd get when you said hi to people versus 10 p.m. versus like 6 a.m.
Yeah.
So People are a lot more intense at 6 a.m.
Yes.
That's cool to know. We'll have to talk more about running because I do love running and always curious to hear what kind of tech people are using. You can go down quite a rabbit hole there. To dig into product though, your background is almost a unique one in that you've been in product for arguably since 2000-ish, maybe even the late 90s. But e-commerce was a really early thing and you were there really at the genesis, like I said, like capital P product role since 2001. And cap that off with e-commerce back when people still used to say, are people really going to buy stuff online? Do you really think that's going to happen? In that context, how has e-commerce changed in the past 20 years? It seems like there's been a lot of movement in both technology, the public perception and acceptance, but also just like what's expected.
For sure. And I'll go back to kind of your definition. I love the way you frame up, and I appreciate you considering me a product person because that's how I've always viewed e-com. Even though I may run the business side of it, the P&L, but you do have to have kind of that classical understanding, not only of the technology that we talked about earlier, how you define product, what it actually means to the world we operate in, but also how we go about building and driving the business on the day-to-day. And what's interesting, I started my career, as you alluded to, with a small company in Seattle called GoToNet. So for those of you that are aficionados on search, we had one of the very first search engines called Dogpile that was actually born at a University of Washington about a year or two before Google came onto the scene. So always been in that product mindset, had the opportunity to spend time with Washington Mutual. What was interesting, a lot of the learnings I had from Washington Mutual, which ultimately became Chase, were around, we had a CMO who's like, I don't want to hire bankers because I can teach anyone banking. I want people that really understand retail and customer experience because that's where they were trying to push their commoditized product of having a checking account. And that kind of stuck with me as I thought about e-commerce over the last 15 to 20 years. And when I first started on e-com, I moved over to the agency side, a small digital shop out of Seattle called Zaz. And we ended up getting acquired by Wunderman Thompson, which moved me to New York. And we did a lot of work at the time. And again, you have to remember it was pre-iPhone, pre-social. It was mainly experiential. So at that time, it's like you still had mail order catalogs. People were still calling in, or you go to a physical location to purchase. Online at that point was really brochureware, for lack of a better word. And you had a few of the bigger players. We did some work early days with Nike and Converse, but I would say a vast majority of the brands were not commerce enabled. Then you had the recession of 2008, and that's where I think you started to see for the first time coming out of that. Part of it, honestly, I give kudos to Demandware for really opening up a SaaS platform where brands could actually move away from on-premise and the heavy tech debt that required. It's the first time having a web store that could be cloud-based. And that kind of brought in this new generation of brands that for the first time could really become commerce-enabled and do it on a way that still met their branding needs. And then, of course, you had the rapid explosion when they got acquired by Salesforce, Shopify, direct-to-consumer, where anyone could start a fashion or direct-to-consumer brand. And now I think you've reached a point where it's almost swung the other direction, where e-commerce has become a very mature market. And I think we're even debating what direct-to-consumer really means. So I think that's where it's come full circle a bit.
That is such an interesting bit right there that you start to talk about with Salesforce, because this has been something we've actually talked about a lot here. Everyone thinks of Salesforce as a CRM.
Right.
Like that's what they started with, what they're still, Salesforce Tower is mostly built on the revenue from CRM. But if you think and look back to their early website and early positioning, it wasn't the best CRM in the world. It was no software. Talk to kind of folks who haven't been around as long who wonder, how did Salesforce get into big commerce and kind of all the things they're into now? And if you go back to the original idea, it was you don't have to run things on premise. You don't have to run your CRM on premise. You don't have to run your e-commerce on premise anymore. It's really interesting to see kind of the lens you put on it there, that this is where we are now, a lot because of that move where it made it a lot simpler. I want to key in real quick on one thing I saw you mention. You've talked a bit about, you feel like e-commerce has maybe commoditized a little bit over the past bit and people have become numb to the pain that you have to go through or negative experiences. Conversely to that, you see a lot of data from Google that people have the lowest tolerance ever for slow load, page speed. They expect everything to just be like zip, and any slight delay, they'll bail. How do you rationalize that with the view that people have become a bit numb to these experiences?
So I think part of it, and the way I would define or separate from a Google perspective, tech perspective, we all just expect things to work. So it's kind of like if you go into a store where everyone's used to tap and pay, like you're saying, if I load a page on my phone and it takes forever, I will bail or bounce. However, from a customer experience standpoint, I think that's where there's still quite a bit of friction. And customers are willing to put up with a brand that skews too heavy on design for design's sake
Mhm.
because they love the brand. So it's not a reflection of tech not working. Good example, no disrespect to any listeners that work for Stone Island, but if you saw the redesign on desktop as well as mobile, like on the homepage, it just begs the question on did they really do due diligence on UX? Because it's a very heavy load, full bleed, looks beautiful, but to navigate and find your way, we can debate how relevant homepages still are with Google. However, it is still very challenging. So that's where I mean that users are still willing to put up with quite a bit of friction that I would argue is unnecessarily put it in front of them to transact.
I think you nailed on one of my big pet peeves. I love graphic design and web design. I want things to be beautiful. All things equal, I'd rather go to a site that is pretty. But you do get these sites that just are gorgeous to look at until you go to use them. And then the facade is just wiped away and it's this just horrible morass of, I'm not saying Stone Island is that, by the way,
Right.
but it just becomes this very hard to use. Like, where do I go? How do I even buy something? I want to give you money. Make it easy for me to do this, and you're not. What's driving that, do you think?
It goes back to looking at it through the lens of two key pillars. One is CX, which you've heard me mention already. So, again, that maniacal focus around digital, physical, and human interactions that has to ladder up to a true content strategy, which I think a lot of brands do not have. So, if you define that content strategy, to your point, where is the right place to interact with that appropriate, beautiful content? On the flip side, I loved what Zara launched recently,
Mhm.
where they put some content editorial components just talking about them within their mobile app. So, perfect place. Obviously, we all know about TikTok, YouTube, I think has really great platform for both short and long form content. And back to website design, there is a place for that beautiful, but you have to have that content strategy first and foremost, and then determine how does that manifest across digital, physical, and human. And the reason I keep going back to physical is a lot of the brands I've worked with have a physical presence, and in many cases started with stores first. And I still believe that a store is really the temple of the brand. It's where you can go interact with the product. A lot of stores now have beautiful design. Working at John Varvatos, he used to have one of a kind artwork from bands that were in the store, drum set, guitar, and then beautiful product and sales associates kind of romance and talk about it.
Mhm.
So I think that's where you can bring those together. But going back to your question, you have to have a really concrete content strategy and approach to CX to execute that across any of those formats.
And I think you started to touch on, you can't discount the ease of going between the store and online and the store and online. I have a Zara jacket that I still wear. It's 15 years old at this point, a black leather jacket. And I don't think it's often thought of as something that's going to last that long, but it's great and I love it. But I keep going back because I had a great experience in the store 15 years ago. But online now, it's easy. I can get what I need because I know my sizes, but also they make the experience very easy. And I love that combination versus, to your point about content, right? Nike's been in the news the other way lately.
Yeah.
They leaned into performance marketing and leaned out of the brand that they had built for decades that made them so successful, and it came back to bite them. Do you have a sense on where we are in the world right now for that kind of strategy versus brand first? Like, do you think people are going to learn the lesson off of that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think you have to, because first and foremost, you have to define brand
Yeah.
and what that means. And I think that's one of the areas we're working through at Esprit at the moment. But the way I look at it is you have to be able to answer first, why do we exist? Why do we deserve to exist? And then where's that white space that we can operate within? And I think that's part of the challenge when you kicked off our conversation today around e-commerce. If you look in the sweet spot, probably about 10 years ago, maybe even the pre-pandemic, any brand could really spin up a Shopify site and cost of media was cheap, run a bunch of advertising through Facebook. You really didn't have to think through that. It's like, oh, I have a cool brand. I'll do some really cool design work and push it out there. But the reality is that's really tough to continue if you're not fundamentally answering and have that North Star to say, okay, why do we deserve to exist as a brand? What do we stand for? And what is that one area we're going after? And I think without that, and especially today with so many choices given to consumers and with the cost of media very expensive, it will be hard to be successful if you don't go back to that brand first mentality.
It's funny you bring that up or position it that way. I don't think it's just e-commerce. We sell software. We operate in the digital experience analytics space. So about as far from fashion and e-commerce as you can possibly get, aside from we work with a lot of e-commerce companies. We're helping people understand what's going on in your e-commerce store. Where are the biggest friction points? How do you deliver a great experience to those users? How do you make your brand easy to access once you're online? But even we're seeing when we're talking to prospects that come in, the number one thing driving it is not performance marketing. It's not direct response. It is people who have interacted with us before. It's people who've heard of us from a friend maybe, or been able to access it from some other kind of broader sense, and then they hone in. So it's really interesting seeing that happen, not just across fashion, like you said, and e-commerce, but I think across the whole world. Media is getting more expensive. My big soapbox for the past couple of years has been attribution is just utter BS. And I think in e-commerce, there's some ability to track last touch in e-commerce, same with B2B. But attribution and the lie we were all sold, I mean, you and I were around at a similar time back in the kind of beginning of the web when the big promise was track everything, know every touch point, you can have full attribution, and it's crap. Like, you can't do it. It's so much of it is going to happen offline. I think dark funnel is a cool way of talking about it now, but I love that people are getting back to that and finally recognizing that again.
No, I agree completely, because my challenge with attribution is I would always ask my team and challenge them, okay, great. Now that we know that, what are we doing with it? And that's where I think attribution models started to fall apart. Because there's one thing to say, oh, it's great, we can attribute this assisted sale to paid search. Like, okay, are we going to do anything different that will give us concrete causality? If we make a change, it's going to directly impact whatever downstream KPI we have.
Yeah.
And I think that's the challenge. I do want to go back because I think you bring up a good point just around sales and partners, because I get pitched pretty much nonstop. And I do think you're spot on that the branding and that approach holds, because you have to go back and have a really clear, differentiated story. I got 2 emails today, and of course, centered around AI.
Oh, everywhere, right?
Yeah. But they lead with, hey, do you have 15 minutes of your time? I love what you're doing at Esprit. And we're an AI company that does this and this, and we work with these 5 partners. But again, just no differentiation on what they do, no introduction or willingness to have a conversation first, or recognition that my time's valuable, or even doing a little bit of due diligence on where Esprit is at the moment. Before leading in with that. So I think that's why they have to be really clear, to your point, is how do you fit in as a solution or potential partner before you even hit that sales pitch right away?
Why do you exist? What is your justification for even being able to send this email?
And how are you different?
Exactly. Why should I listen to you?
Yeah.
If you can't articulate that first.
Without saying we have a unique AI solution, because that's not really that different.
Yeah. So. You're unique just like everyone else.
Exactly.
People on my team here laugh because I don't answer my phone. I tell them I don't really answer email because I get 50 phone calls a day. I get 500 emails, and it's exactly that. Now the word of the day is AI.
Right.
That actually gives us to a good point, right? So you're at Esprit now. And how are you looking at building that brand story there? Like, what does that look like for Esprit? It's a company that had a lot of success, it was down a little bit. And how are you looking to position that for, maybe don't call it a comeback, but a new rise?
I think it's a combination. Part of it is you have to test and learn. So big believer in that methodology and that approach. So one of the things is we do know that we have a lot of people that remember Spree whenever I mention it.
Mhm.
They're like, oh yeah, I used to shop there when I was a kid or remember it from my mom. So there is this little bit of a halo where people remember us, but they haven't experienced us or shopped us. So that leads us down a different path on what we started to do about a year and a half, 2 years ago was probably go a bit too big in the US. So rolling out a couple of pop-ups that we could test with across New York, LA, Chicago, Miami. But all of a sudden, once you have that many pop-ups, you have to step back and wait a second. That means we need a national campaign to support that. And that's expensive to drive awareness nationally because each of those markets are uniquely different. Then you have to drill down on those markets. Product assortment can be different. Then we were exploring at the same time parallel paths selling into Nordstrom and Urban and probably 200 or so specialty retailers because I do think wholesale has to play a key role in modern e-com or brands going forward. And then obviously our own experience. So that's a lot to relaunch right away.
Mhm.
And I think we were too ambitious in relying on the fact that we had a little bit of heritage. I think we got too far ahead of ourselves and saying, oh, we have a bit of a head start. So we've dialed that back, taken all the data points and learnings from those pop-ups, a little bit of our e-com numbers, and now we're doing a bit of a reset to say maybe there's a scaled back version. Do we pivot into a license model? What is the right way for Spree to continue to live on as a brand?
Interesting. Yeah. When you are a manufacturer and you sell direct and you sell in person, building your brand is probably more important than ever because you got to justify why is someone going to pick you, like you said, at a Nordstrom where there's hundreds of options. Why are they going to go to your pop up and why are they going to come to your website to buy direct? And those are probably all slightly different reasons you have to capitalize with people. Do you look at it that way? Do you break it down by that channel, or is it more just about build the brand and get people to understand what it is Spree stands for or is, or where it fits in their life?
Yeah, I think it goes back to those three core components I mentioned.
Mhm.
And some of this was real time learnings that we got on the fly. But again, why do we exist? We feel like we're a heritage brand.
Mhm.
People know us for that splash of color, that pop. It's like, okay, what does that mean today? And why do you and I deserve to have Esprit back? And I think that's the part we're trying to fit into the puzzle with kind of the white space is to say, okay, where do we sit? Do we sit adjacent to a Madewell, a J. Crew with a little bit of a modern tone to it? Or are we more a Zara, H&M? So I think some of those learnings, we have to see where the receptiveness is and where do we have an opportunity? And then how do we position the brand without giving up what our heritage and DNA is? So I would say longer way, it's a work in progress, but you have to take those touch points, all those interactions from conversations with store associates to everything that's measurable, some of the friction points online. We had a bigger business in Europe, completely different customer base that we had learnings on. So how do we pull all those together and reframe that and say, what is the right iteration going forward for a modern version of Esprit?
Mhm.
And it may mean we just decide to do a certain category or classification and really start out small. And I think that's where you see with a lot of brands that are out there today, back to what I think you were touching on with channel, how do we think about it? Is why I was saying direct to consumer needs to be redefined because I do think it's a little bit of a misnomer. Does it mean you're eliminating the middle person and there's no longer this specialty retail, but you're still going to consumer? And do you really want to eliminate that from your conversation or channel approach, given all the headwinds that you're faced with in building a brand and cost and media dollars? I think it's a vital part. So does direct to consumer, even if there is an intermediary, really mean you're not going directly to your consumers, if that makes sense?
So how do you think about gathering those touch points? Like, how are you looking at talking to store associates is probably pretty easy. But the rest of it, do you go direct to misuse the word you were just saying, right? Do you go direct to consumer to ask them? Do you look at how people are operating on your website? Is there other channels to be listening to how people are viewing and interacting and thinking about Esprit?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And because at the end of the day, I mean, while I believe retail and having been in it for a while, grew up as a son of a retailer, is still really complicated. For the one reason is it's all about inventory optimization, making sure you have the right product, right time, right market,
Mhm.
which is really tough. So to bring that back a layer and look at what are the touch points that can give us insight on trend, on product sell through, any of those components. So for physical retail, we do look beyond just your traffic counter. There's good partners. We don't work with it yet, but Crave Retail is doing really interesting components to identify friction of not just measuring you walk into a store, but you try on this sweater in a fitting room. And does that give you a higher intent to purchase and walk out with product?
Hmm.
So looking at those pieces, or why do you not bring something into the fitting room? We have all that data you can track in addition to going back to surveys, polling our sales associates to say, what are they saying with product? Is there a fit issue? Customers will tell you right away. So it's both qualitative and quantitative data that you now have access to in your location. Then you can combine that with data you're getting on site. So behavioral data, add to cart rates through browse, through other patterns, all the way back upstream to engagement within videos or content that's out there through TikTok, Instagram, and other channels.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I want to zoom back up a little bit and go back a ways in the conversation. The other piece, though, is thinking about e-com like a product. I think actually most things, at least in business, would probably benefit from a little bit more thinking about them like a product. Like we always say here when we're doing marketing planning and how we run the organization within LogRocket that is marketing, we think about it like a product. We do planning, we do capacity planning, we try and avoid shiny object syndrome and too much work in progress like the plague. But back to, you have a really cool background. You've been in product since your first capital P product job was in the early 2000s. That's a time we don't often get to talk about. I think, please take this more in the way of like, it was where the societal discussion was around product, but like Tom from Office Space, the movie Office Space came out in 1999.
Oh, yeah.
And right, Tom, the guy who came with the jump to conclusions, Matt, I'm a people person. I take the specs to the engineers. I have people skills. Like that was, I think, the closest thing most of the populace had to understanding what a product manager was at the time. And fast forward to now, everyone wants to be in product. Everything's product led or product thinking or product this, product that. And people are coming out of Ivy League schools trying to go to FANG companies to be PMs. From an operational standpoint, how has that change looked from the inside? Like, how do you compare what you were doing 20 years ago in e-com and product to now?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think some things really haven't changed. You touched on it just then. There's always been a finite amount of resources. So technology, in my mind, has always been oversubscribed because there's way too much demand from whether it's C-level executives, whether it's business partners, all the way down that need our resources. So I think the one common thread is how do you look to prioritize and what levers do you prioritize against? And for me, that's always been business outcome, level of effort, and potential complexity. So that piece has always been, I think, a throughput within common product management. Way back in the day, we were asking those questions. Okay, what's the business case? Great. How do we t-shirt size it? What's the level of effort? And then how complex is it? Maybe it fits into something else we have on our roadmap. Is it a high priority? So just having those conversations. Now, what has changed that you kicked off the conversation with, there's a lot more tools that I think make product management easier. And what I mean by that, it's easier for us to be more transparent
Mhm.
with our partners and collaborate much easier than in the past. Because before you would use some antiquated software to build requirements, usually done in a vacuum. If you had a team somewhere else, not easy to use any collaboration tools, jump on a Zoom or Teams meeting, whatever the case is. So I think a lot of those roadblocks that were there have made it much, much more efficient. And the time to market can be much faster than it was in the past.
One funny thing that just occurred to me, I remember not that long ago, days like Black Friday, you would get major outages at e-commerce platforms, when people were all jumping on. And it was a real thing. There were teams dedicated to just how do we keep our site up during this once a year onslaught. And it seems like that has just drifted out of public perception. That doesn't really happen anymore. There used to be lists of the best and worst performers on Black Friday. And now it's just assumed that
it'll work.
Yes, it's just going to work. Has that changed how you think about e-commerce, like from a product standpoint?
Not really, because it has been subtle over the time.
Mhm.
Like I was having this conversation with someone last week about Akamai.
Yeah.
And that used to be like a big part of our conversation. I was like, oh, I can't remember the last time Akamai was part of my tech solution or part of the conversation, because as you alluded to, AWS just makes it easier and takes care of that. Or Cloudflare, yes, it's still there, but not as much as it used to be. We used to have to worry about, oh, we need Akamai to do X, Y, and Z. So I think it's been a gradual enough change over time. But while that has decreased some of the complexity, you have now a rise of other complexions within the ecosystem. And I think Shopify is a blessing and a curse, because in one respect, they've made it insanely easy to stand up a site, but they have a number of plugins and connectors. So you can get any partner from loyalty, SMS, email, analytics. All of a sudden, you have 10 connectors running in your site. And now that'll be a drag on site performance.
Mhm.
Whereas in the past, it was around hosting and if the site will fail. So I would say there's newer complexities that we have to think about. But you're exactly right. I do think most of the time, the days of worrying about having a massive team on staff, having servers hosted in co-locations, so you have to have a team ready on standby, are pretty much removed, or that's passed on to hosting partners like AWS. Yeah.
I mean, I remember having GCP and all. I remember, though, having the big dark room, the knock, where people would be, and they'd gear up where they'd be like, all right, we're here for 72 hours straight now. And it was a marathon. But I think you nailed it. It seems like performance is still a problem. It's just we've traded a big binary problem. You're either on, you're up, or you're off, to a much more subtle problem, but still huge financial outcomes. Like you said, now you can have 10 plugins, you need to load quickly. People are aware of not just performance, but even just the friction points of how do I navigate? How do I operate? Does this flow the way I expect? And all those little choices. Like it's much harder to find those things than it is to find my site failed.
Right.
But the economic outcome is possibly larger just because the world of e-commerce is so much bigger now.
Exactly. And now think about with a mobile device, I can't tell you how many times that I will get an executive that will reach out to me at all hours, like, hey, Scott, our site must be down. I can't find it on, low on mobile. I'm getting a page load issue. And trying to troubleshoot that on one hand could be a real issue, but it could be network connectivity. It could be Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
There's just a number of issues, especially in major cities like we're in Boston and New York. When I walk out, sometimes 5G just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And to try to troubleshoot that side of it to really make sure it's not an issue becomes more complex. So I think that's where, in one respect, 100%, I think in terms of efficiency, not having your big, massive data center and having to have on-premise solutions, engineers on-premise to be able to troubleshoot has shifted away. But you still have what I would call a lot of issues that keep me up at night around e-com or data. Now you throw in security that we didn't have before. So there's newer shifts that I think cause some of those concerns. So it's not fully eliminated, it's just different.
And then you throw in the rise of front-end architectures and the fact that now no longer is a lot of this application logic running on your servers. It's running on my web, my mobile phone or my computer. And good luck finding out what went on from the traditional means that you used to use. I do want to take a second and just pivot a little bit, because there's one other thing I want to make sure we cover. And this was, I was looking at your LinkedIn and I noticed you have several advisory roles across a lot of different things, right? Like if I'm gonna summarize a little bit, so let me know if I get this inaccurate, but you're working with an AI decision intelligence tool. You are working with a company that provides advisory services in capital, returns management. That one makes dead on sense, by the way. And then AI-based discovery of outfits and style for fashion brands. How do you find time to operate in these advisory capacities on top of what I assume is a demanding role helping Esprit rise back up here?
Some of them have been just through the years.
Mm-hmm.
As much as I would like to think I woke up and just constantly have this high demand of people seeking what perceived knowledge I may have, a lot of them have been born out of, honestly, back in 2008, 2010. I think you had this really interesting dynamic in New York where you had a lot of the tech was still being created out of the Bay Area, maybe a little bit in Pacific Northwest, and then it was implemented in New York.
Mm-hmm.
So this was before we had Silicon Alley or whatever terminology they'd coined for New York, Boston. And now you have obviously multiple tech hubs. So I think at that time, because of my technology background, and as you alluded to, that product background, a lot of these up and coming, whether it's fashion tech or just retailers as a whole, were looking, to get my point of view.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them are just looking at how do I sell into a brand like Esprit or Varvatos or Intermix and just help them shape their products. So I would say it is something I feel passionate about because I do believe startups and early stage companies, you can get the best of both worlds, which is why I do invest that time because one, I can give them feedback, but at the same time, I rely on them to be at the forefront of technology I'm having or potentially looking at down the line. So that's where I use it as kind of an incubation and early trade-off, if you will.
Makes sense. Like you said, all this is changing so quickly, and the problems that we faced 10 years ago are almost in some ways directly oppositional sometimes to the ones we're facing today. I guess it makes sense. Like stay up on what's going on, and the best way to do it is to be part of it. I love that.
Exactly.
Cool. Scott, I've loved having you on. It's been a fantastic time. I feel like I learned a lot about the evolution of e-commerce, as well as just some cool pieces to hear you kind of put a different way than I've been thinking about some of this. I could go on and on with you for probably a couple more hours, but if people want to follow up with you or ask questions or pick your brain, or maybe what's the best place to find you? Is it LinkedIn? Is there somewhere else?
Yeah, LinkedIn is by far the best place. So I try to keep that pretty up to date, but that's the best source. At least as a good starting point.
Yeah.
And then we can go from there.
Any drops of knowledge for people upcoming into e-com, maybe looking to kick it off, either moving into e-com or product? What can people do to get started there? What's a good spot?
I'm still a passionate believer in starting agency side. Mm-hmm. There's definitely a lot of shifts going through with agency, but agency today means a lot of different things. There's some really cool up and coming design agency partners that are out there. I think it's one of the best learnings I had in my career because you're surrounded by talented, innovative people that are always trying to push the boundaries. And you typically get exposure to multiple brands and multiple e-commerce solutions so you can start to navigate and see what resonates. Also, big believer in the software and tech side for that same reason is you get exposure to up and coming technology and partnering with brands and crafting that story. And I do think there is still a demand for brands to have that internal knowledge once you've refined and professionalized it a bit on an agency or software side. So that to me is probably the advice I give to team members. If they have an opportunity to do that, they should definitely give it a good run.
Awesome. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, man. I had a blast. I hope you did.
Likewise. Thanks.